Picture yourself as one of the world's most powerful tech executives, traveling between continents with complete confidence. Your journey takes an unexpected turn at a Canadian airport when federal authorities approach you with handcuffs instead of courtesy. This wasn't just another airport detention. This single arrest at Vancouver's international terminal pulled a peaceful middle power into the center of the 21st century's defining superpower rivalry. Canada found itself trapped between two titans, unable to remain neutral any longer. Let's explore how the struggle between Washington and Beijing has fundamentally reshaped Canada's identity, economy, and future. On a winter day in December 2018, Vancouver International Airport became ground zero for a diplomatic earthquake. Meng Wanzhou, Huawei's chief financial officer and daughter of the company's founder, was detained following an American extradition request. The United States accused her of financial crimes connected to circumventing sanctions against Iran. For Canada, this seemed straightforward legal cooperation with its closest ally. Beijing saw something entirely different: a politically motivated kidnapping orchestrated by Washington. China's retaliation came swiftly and brutally. Within days, two Canadian citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, were arrested in China on espionage allegations. Their detention conditions were harsh, involving prolonged interrogations, sleep deprivation, and constant surveillance under artificial lighting. Meanwhile, Meng remained in her multimillion-dollar Vancouver residence, monitored but comfortable, free to shop and entertain guests. This stark contrast created a public relations disaster for the Canadian government. Beijing didn't limit its response to people. Canada's agricultural sector became collateral damage as China banned canola seed imports, citing pest concerns, wiping out $2 billion in trade overnight. Restrictions on pork and beef followed, demonstrating China's willingness to inflict economic pain. This standoff dragged on for over 1,000 days, finally ending in September 2021 when American prosecutors reached a settlement with Meng. She returned to China as a celebrated figure while the two Michaels came home visibly traumatized. Canada learned a harsh lesson: being principled and following international law offers no protection when you're caught between competing empires. By late 2024, the conflict zone shifted from diplomacy to driveways. Chinese manufacturers like BYD were producing sophisticated electric vehicles at prices around $15,000, making green transportation accessible globally. For a world confronting climate change, this appeared beneficial. Washington disagreed entirely, viewing these affordable cars as state-subsidized weapons designed to destroy North American manufacturing while potentially spying on users through integrated technology. The United States imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles in mid-2024, then pressured Canada to follow suit or risk the entire continental trade framework. Canada faced an impossible choice. The government wanted to champion environmental progress, but the automotive sector's deep integration with America meant that any deviation could trigger catastrophic economic consequences. 3/4 of Canadian exports flow southward. If Canada became a backdoor for Chinese vehicles entering North America, Washington would likely dismantle the trade agreement that forms the backbone of the Canadian economy. On October 1, 2024, Canada matched the American tariff, adding its own 100% levy on Chinese electric vehicles plus 25% on Chinese steel and aluminum. The absurdity was striking. Canada effectively doubled the cost of the world's most affordable electric cars while simultaneously mandating that all new vehicle sales must be zero-emission within a decade. China responded predictably, launching trade investigations into Canadian canola and chemicals. Every time Canada aligned with American security priorities, Beijing targeted Canadian farmers and exporters. A BYD vehicle that cost roughly $15,000 Canadian dollars in China now approached $30,000 after tariffs, not to protect consumers but to justify the $46 billion in subsidies Canada promised to Volkswagen and Stellantis for building battery facilities. This wasn't merely a trade dispute. Canada had entered a subsidy arms race, betting its fiscal future on securing a share of the electric vehicle market before China dominated it completely. Imagine election night. You voted, complained about candidates online, and settled in to watch results. But another campaign has been running invisibly, one without lawn signs or door knockers. Throughout 2024 and 2025, Canada grappled with revelations about foreign interference that felt like a political thriller. Years of whispers about Chinese meddling in Canadian democracy, particularly the 2019 and 2021 federal elections, had become undeniable. The Hogue Commission, led by Justice Marie-Josée Hogue, delivered its final report in January 2025 with stark conclusions. She labeled information manipulation an existential threat to Canadian democracy, warning that democracies face attacks from all directions. While she found no evidence of traitors or altered election outcomes, the integrity of democratic processes was under relentless assault through disinformation and transnational repression. The interference took concrete forms. Reports surfaced in 2022 and 2023 about clandestine Chinese police stations operating in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. These weren't obvious facilities but rather locations hidden within community centers or shops. Their alleged purpose: monitoring, harassing, and intimidating Chinese diaspora members, sending a clear message about voting consequences and family safety back in China. By late 2025, the RCMP closed its investigation into Montreal area stations without charges, triggering a massive defamation lawsuit. Whether officially sanctioned or not, the psychological impact was real. Disinformation campaigns targeted specific politicians. Conservative MP Michael Cheung, vocal about Beijing's treatment of Uyghur Muslims, faced coordinated attacks on WeChat during the 2021 election with false claims of anti-Chinese sentiment. In May 2023, Canada expelled a Chinese diplomat for allegedly plotting to intimidate Cheung's family in Hong Kong. China called the allegations baseless and expelled a Canadian diplomat in response. The dark irony persisted. While freaking out about Chinese interference, Canada desperately tried maintaining trade relationships because both nations benefited economically. Canada attempted to secure its democracy while leaving entry points open for commerce. Politicians constantly looked over their shoulders while voters questioned whether news articles came from Ottawa journalists or Shanghai bot farms. This is the new normal where the battlefield isn't geographical but digital, fought in news feeds and social media platforms. Close your eyes and imagine the Arctic. Polar bears, endless ice, isolated research stations. China sees something radically different: immense economic opportunity. In 2018, China declared itself a near-Arctic state, despite being geographically distant from the region. Beijing is playing a generational game. As climate change melts polar ice, the Northwest Passage through Canada's northern islands becomes a viable shipping route that could reduce travel time between Asia and Europe by weeks, functioning as a northern Suez Canal. Control of this passage represents massive economic leverage. Here's Canada's awkward position. We claim the Northwest Passage as internal waters under Canadian jurisdiction. The United States, our closest ally, disagrees, calling it an international strait open to all, including American naval vessels, without requiring Canadian permission. China watches this family dispute with interest. They've launched the Polar Silk Road Initiative, building powerful icebreakers like the Shuilong 2. In summer 2025, the U.S. Coast Guard shadowed Chinese research vessels off Alaska, suspecting dual-use missions, mapping seafloors for future submarine routes while ostensibly studying climate change. In response, 2025 saw intensified North American defense cooperation. Canada and the United States conducted Operation Latitude and Northern Edge exercises involving patrol aircraft, frigates, and thousands of troops training for extreme cold warfare. Former Defense Minister Anita Anand emphasized the necessity of protecting Arctic sovereignty, especially after a Chinese surveillance balloon drifted over Yukon in February 2023 before being shot down by an American fighter jet. Canada faces a Goldilocks problem. Leaning too heavily on American defense essentially surrenders sovereignty to Washington, but going it alone allows China and Russia, increasingly cooperating in the Arctic, to establish presence unchallenged. Russia has been facilitating Chinese companies registering for operations in Russian-controlled Arctic territory, with registrations increasing 87% since 2022. Canada owns valuable, frigid real estate but lacks resources to defend it. Our neighbor thinks the driveway is public property while a distant party arrives with measuring equipment and excavation tools. Critically, Canada's North Warning System radar chain still uses 1980s technology, attempting to track modern hypersonic missiles with equipment older than original Nintendo consoles. Upgrading will cost billions, a bill Canada can no longer ignore as the Cold War intensifies. Imagine you're a senior officer at Canada's Security Intelligence Service. Your mission: protecting Canada from state-sponsored digital espionage. 4 years, you've sat in classified meetings with counterparts from the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, the Five Eyes Alliance, receiving one consistent message: remove Huawei from 5G networks or intelligence sharing stops. Canada was the reluctant member at the Five Eyes table, hesitating while the other four banned Huawei and ZTE between 2018 and 2019. Why the delay? Canada was managing the two-Michael situation, terrified that banning Huawei while Meng remained under house arrest would trigger escalation. By May 2022, the pressure became unbearable. The United States hinted that Canada's access to high-level intelligence was at risk. Innovation Minister François-Philippe Champagne finally announced the ban, citing thorough security reviews. But the ban wasn't instantaneous. Canada gave telecommunications giants like Bell and Telus until June 2024 to remove existing 5G equipment and until December 2027 for 4G gear. As we move through late 2025, the great replacement continues. It's an engineering nightmare, changing an engine while the car drives at highway speeds. Thousands of cell towers from downtown Toronto to remote Nunavut require physical access and upgrades. Estimates suggest Canadian telecoms will spend over $700 million, with minimal government financial assistance unlike the United States. Huawei's presence in Canada extended beyond cell towers. They funded hundreds of millions in university research. In 2024 and 2025, the federal government implemented national security policies for research partnerships, essentially telling universities that federal funding requires cutting ties with high-risk foreign entities like Huawei. Canada is finally aligning with Five Eyes partners, but it's been a slow, expensive, politically painful separation. The realization, 5G isn't about faster streaming, it's a nation's central nervous system. The United States made clear that allowing China to build your nervous system excludes you from the inner circle. The year is 2025 and the world runs on lithium, graphite, cobalt, and rare earth elements. These materials are essential for smartphones, fighter jets, and wind turbines. For 20 years, China controlled approximately 70% of global refining capacity. But Canada sits on enormous untapped deposits of critical minerals, and in the US-China Cold War, Canadian geology has become a national security matter. Canada's critical mineral strategy evolved from bureaucratic paperwork to geopolitical weaponry throughout 2024 and 2025. Ottawa aggressively used the Investment Canada Act to block Chinese state-owned companies from acquiring Canadian mining firms. Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson stated clearly that investments threatening national security would be stopped. In dramatic moves, Canada ordered Chinese investors to divest from companies like Ultra Lithium and Siamine Resource Group, signaling that while China could buy lobster, it couldn't own mines. Here's the unexpected twist. Despite being allies, the U.S. administration imposed a 10% national emergency tariff on Canadian energy resources in February 2025, including critical minerals. American protectionism demands everything be processed domestically. This created a bizarre triple bind for Canada. China retaliates for blocked investments by restricting exports of graphite and germanium needed by Canadian tech companies. The United States is our primary customer but taxes our minerals to force deeper industrial integration. Canada attempts building domestic processing facilities to avoid being merely resource extractors but struggles competing with Chinese prices. The reality check. While discussing de-risking from China, the mathematics are brutal. In 2025, China still controls processing technology for most minerals. Canadian companies wanting to refine lithium often must buy equipment from China. We're in a resource war where weapons are excavation tools and chemical processing. Canada desperately wants to be the West's green supplier but discovers that building global supply chains from scratch is exponentially harder and more expensive than simply extraction. Imagine being present at a high-stakes Washington dinner in early 2025. Across the table sit influential figures like U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Canada's Deputy PM Chrystia Freeland. They're not discussing traditional free trade. The old world, where we purchase the cheapest products regardless of the seller's government, is officially dead. Welcome to friendshoring. This represents what policy experts call the new Washington Consensus. For decades, Canada championed globalization, believing that trading with China would eventually make them more democratic, rule-following, and predictable. That didn't happen. Instead, the West realized it had inadvertently funded its greatest rival while hollowing out domestic manufacturing. Throughout 2024 and 2025, the approach shifted from engagement to de-risking. Freeland has advocated that democratic economies must build supply chains exclusively through other democracies. But friendship with America comes with steep costs. To remain in the club, Canada adopted industrial policy, government picking winners and losers through billions in subsidies. In April 2025, the Canada-US Energy Transformation Task Force released reports highlighting massive integration of power grids and battery supply chains, aiming to create Fortress North America. By aligning so closely with America, Canada essentially told Beijing, "We don't trust you." China responded accordingly. In 2025, Canadian exports to China outside raw commodities like oil and potash hit significant declines. Canada is losing access to the world's largest middle class just as America becomes more protectionist. The dark irony: while friendshoring with America to avoid China, the United States still hits Canada with tariffs. In early 2025, America First trade sentiment evolved rather than disappeared. Washington expects Canada to be all in against China but still treats Canadian steel and lumber as threats to American jobs when politically convenient. Canada is essentially the sidekick in a buddy cop movie where the lead actor keeps accidentally elbowing us. You're 18 years old in Guangzhou or Chandigarh. You've seen social media posts about beautiful Canadian campuses, promises of post-graduation work permits, and pathways to citizenship. Your family spends life savings sending you to a small Ontario college. But arriving in late 2024, the dream becomes nightmare. You're sharing a basement apartment with 6 others, paying $2,000 monthly for a bunk bed, relying on food banks for groceries. This was Canada's education industrial complex built over the past decade. We used international students as revenue sources for universities and cheap labor for service industries. At peak, international students contributed over $22 billion to the Canadian economy, exceeding auto parts or lumber exports. In 2025, the bubble burst. The housing crisis became so politically toxic that government took drastic action. January 2025 brought even stricter caps than the previous year. By October 2024, study permit issuances plummeted 60%. For the first time in decades, Canada's population actually decreased in the third quarter of 2025. Why does this matter for the US-China Cold War? International education was one of Canada's biggest soft power exports to China. In 2024, over 100,000 Chinese citizens held study permits in Canada. Future Chinese elites learning Canadian values while spending billions. As Canada tightened restrictions, imposing enhanced financial verification and capping permits, Chinese government-controlled media launched campaigns portraying Canada as unsafe, racist, and economically declining. By cutting student flows, Canada didn't just cool the housing market, it severed one of the last remaining people-to-people bridges with China. Universities addicted to foreign tuition now face massive budget shortfalls. Some smaller colleges faced bankruptcy in 2025. We're witnessing Cold War collateral damage. To protect internal stability around housing, we sacrificed a major economic and diplomatic connection to the East. Canada is discovering you can't simultaneously be a global education hub and a geopolitical fortress. The open society is closing doors and the world, especially China, is noticing. Imagine scrolling through your social media feed at 1 in the morning, watching someone build a log cabin in Alberta. It feels harmless, but behind that scroll, a war rages over metadata. In 2024, Canada followed the American lead, launching a national security review of TikTok. While America moved toward complete bans unless the company was sold, Canada took a more measured approach, banning corporate offices while initially allowing app usage. But moving into 2025, following evidence from security services about potential data harvesting and algorithmic manipulation during election cycles, Canada tightened restrictions. The concern wasn't about China seeing your dance videos. It was about information sovereignty. If an algorithm controlled by a foreign adversary decides what millions of Canadians see on their phones, does a Canadian public square even exist anymore? A cybersecurity expert testified in mid-2025 that digital platforms are the new high ground. Controlling the feed means controlling the narrative, and in Cold Wars, narrative is everything. China's response was masterful deflection. They pointed to Canada's Online News Act and Online Streaming Act, claiming Canada was censoring the internet and stifling innovation. This digital divorce reflects a larger trend: the splintering internet, where the Western internet, Google, Meta, X, and the Chinese internet, TikTok, Weibo, become completely separated. Canada, once a bridge between these worlds, now firmly stands behind the Western firewall. The lesson: in the US-China Cold War, there's no neutral technology. Every application, every chip, every fiber optic cable is a potential frontline. Canada has chosen its side, but the cost is a less connected, more paranoid digital world. Imagine you're a Canadian taxpayer. For years you've heard the joke: Canada's defense strategy is a single call to the Pentagon. We've spent decades comfortably under the American security umbrella, spending about 1.3% of GDP on defense while America grumbled about freeloading. But in 2025, grumbling turned to roaring. With Donald Trump's return to the White House and his aggressive stance on NATO burden sharing, Canada's free ride hit a brick wall. The United States gave Ottawa a choice: reach the 2% NATO spending target now or be treated as a security risk rather than a partner. The pressure worked. In June 2025, in a move shocking domestic voters and international allies, Prime Minister Mark Carney, who had recently assumed leadership after a Liberal Party transition, announced Canada would hit the 2% target this fiscal year, 5 years ahead of previous schedules. In an increasingly dangerous and divided world, Canada must assert its sovereignty, Carney stated, emphasizing rebuilding, rearming, and reinvesting. But here's the reality of that rearmament in the context of the US-China Cold War. It's not just about more soldiers. It's about hard power in places where China and America are most likely to clash. In late 2025, Canada finally committed to a $60 billion project replacing its aging submarine fleet with up to 12 conventionally powered submarines capable of under-ice operations in the Arctic. Why? Because as the U.S. Navy pivots focus to the South China Sea, they expect Canada to police its own backyard. If we can't track Chinese or Russian submarines in our waters, America will do it and send us an unaffordable bill. The financial reality: to fund the extra $9.3 billion for this year's defense spike, government made brutal decisions. The 2025 economic statement showed cuts to infrastructure projects and significant reallocation away from social programs. Canada is effectively trading its peaceable kingdom identity for a Fortress North America badge. We're buying 88 F-35 fighter jets, upgrading NORAD radar systems using 1980s microchips, and ramping ammunition production to levels unseen since the original Cold War. By end of 2025, Canada's defense budget reached $62.7 billion, more than the entire GDP of some small countries. We're spending like a superpower while feeling like a middle power. The tragedy: Canada is no longer allowed to be the polite mediator. America demands a heavily armed ally on its northern border while China views our military buildup as direct provocation. Canada is arming up because the rules-based world we loved is being replaced by a might-makes-right world, and we're tired of being the only person at a knife fight holding a hockey stick. Where does this leave Canada heading into 2026? We're a transformed country. We've evolved from global citizen to continental fortress. We've imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese vehicles, banned their tech giants, restricted their students, and doubled down on massive military expansion. The conclusion: Canada has officially chosen sides. The middle path is gone. We're now the primary northern outpost of the American industrial and military machine. The moral lesson: in a world of giants, the rules-based order only functions as long as giants agree to follow rules. When they stop, middle powers like Canada are forced to sacrifice independence to purchase security. We've traded our ability to talk to everyone for protection from the one neighbor holding all the cards. But questions remain. Can Canada survive a 60-year Cold War if our biggest trade partner keeps hitting us with friendly fire tariffs? Or will we eventually be completely absorbed into a North American Union just to keep the lights on? Are we making the right choice aligning so closely with America? Or are we committing a historic mistake by burning bridges with China? The answers will define not just Canada's future, but the nature of middle power survival in an age of renewed great power competition.